Hi, everyone. I'm BJ. I'm the genealogy specialist at the Maine State Library. And tonight I'm going to talk about something that causes some people to panic, which is finding records that aren't in English, because a lot of things were not written in English to start with. And so it can be difficult. And you don't necessarily want to pay a translator for everything. Sometimes it's the way to go. But I'm going to show you some tricks for how to avoid that. And you certainly want to know that the record is relevant before you pay somebody as a translator. So, it's bad enough thinking you found the record and you realize it's not your ancestor. It'd be even worse to pay money to get it translated and find it's not your ancestor. So I'm going to start with a very bit about like a 3-slide long PowerPoint, and then we'll switch to looking at actual websites. So are you seeing my screen now? Good. And I'm going to turn off my video so you don't have cats running around in the background distracting you. Okay, so I first want to talk a bit about languages changing and how even in English, sometimes there are difficulties. So how many of you think you can define daughter-in-law? If somebody's listed on a census as someone's daughter-in-law, how are they related? Any ideas? Well, I'm guessing most of you would say it's the wife of someone's child. Well, it could also, in some times and places in English, mean stepdaughter, especially like the first half of the 19th century in Scotland. It hadn't died out as that use. I have seen cases in, say, the 1851 census where it says stepdaughter, or sorry, daughter-in-law, and it's an 11-year-old, and people find that and panic. It's like, she got married so young. No, her mother remarried. In colonial New England, junior and senior did not necessarily mean father and son. It meant two men with the same name, usually in the same town, so that they couldn't be distinguished by, John of Salem and John Derby of Salem and John Derby of Lynn. So you would have John Derby Sr.'s the older one, Junior's the younger one. They may have been father and son, they may have been uncle and nephew, cousins, and even not related. You often, we tend to think of people when it says, the late so-and-so, the late Robert Thompson, we assume that means someone's died. In older records, you'll often see the description of, Robert Thompson, late of Portland, Maine, which means he used to live there and he doesn't anymore. And in Scottish records before about 1900, you'll often, instead of saying the deceased, it'll say the umquilla. I'm not quite sure where that comes from, but that's a use in Scots English. Relict often meant widow of. Tutor in British, both Scottish and English law, didn't mean what we think of now as someone hired to teach a subject to somebody, but was often the essentially the person who was the had the guardianship of a child. And compere was often used in Scotland and in other countries in a legal context, basically meaning to question in a legal setting or in a formal setting. So when you look at old Kirk session records, which are church court records in Scotland, they will often say compere instead of, we interrogated or we questioned. And so that's one of the things that, even though you think you know the language, if you had a document with 2 or 3 of these and you weren't getting the distinctions, you wouldn't be understanding the document. Does that make sense to everybody? That, it is worth, even in English, when you're dealing with a different time and place, figuring out if there are words that are being used differently from how we use them. Okay, so. And the other reason to mention this is that Google Translate, which we're going to look at later, is based on the modern language. So if you're looking at a marriage contract from 1753 in Quebec, it may be in French that is not, even if you type the right thing, what you read into Google Translate, it may still miss certain subtleties of the language. The other thing you run into is non-English alphabets. These make life comparatively more difficult. The ones you're most likely to run into are Cyrillic, which is what Russian and some other Eastern European languages are written in. Greek letters. Hebrew and Yiddish are written with the same alphabet, even though Hebrew is a Middle Eastern Semitic language and Yiddish is essentially German. You won't see much, for most of us, reading in Korean, which is an alphabet, unlike Japanese and Chinese, which are characters. And the other thing is Roman numerals. In older documents in English, in England and Scotland, there are some differences with Roman numerals as we learned them in school. 9 was often written as V and then 4 I's, although we had learned it in school as an I and an X. And often if you've got 2 or 3 or 4 I's in older UK records that have Roman numerals, the last one of the I's will look like a J. And so you'll just want to be aware of that some of what we learned is the conventions of Roman numerals, at least what we were taught when I was in school, doesn't quite work, that they were used slightly differently in the UK. I will say I found very little use of Roman numerals in American records in the era where they're still in quite a bit of use in the UK. So we'll take that as a win. So I told you it was a quick PowerPoint. So now let's go and look at records, or how to find records, because that's the issue we have. So let me share my screen again. And this is the website for Library and Archives Canada, which is the equivalent of the National Archives. And as you see, I've got it up here in French, and I can mostly figure out what it says, but, and so there are 2 options here. And one is to use the translation feature of the browser, which is this rectangle. And if we hit this, it will let us do that. But because Canada is a bilingual country, you also see a thing here that says English, and it takes us to the English page written by them rather than something that's being machine translated. Does that make sense to everybody? What's happening? So if we go to the National Library of Ireland, they have the same thing. They have their website in English. And if we switch there, we get it in Gaelic. And again, you see that you can do this translation here. So that's very handy. It gets nicer even when this is the National Archives of Ukraine. And I have no chance at this. I have no, the French I could guess at. The Gaelic, well, not quite, but this just looks like a bunch of marks on my screen. But notice even for this, what's up in the corner? Saying, let's have it in English. And it takes a bit, it doesn't get everything. These are probably not actual text. These, what it didn't translate is probably writing embedded in the graphic. So if we open image in a new tab and we go here, see how that's in the image? So the machine is not going to be, they are not going to translate this, certainly not through Google Translate. But even with this going through, and you get news here about stuff, including the good news that several German organizations have been helping the Ukraine archives keep their documents safe, which is good to see. But again, you can, the other thing here is you'll notice they also have with visual impairment. So that's, I was working with somebody recently who understands a language but doesn't read it. And we were actually in a couple cases able to click on this and get the page read to her in the original language. But as here you go back to the Ukrainian. So that's something to always look for. Now, what will happen is when we get to actual records, they'll be like these are with the image, but this will help you navigate for finding those records. And what you're going to find is that a lot of these websites are taking English as pretty much as the international language. And if they offer something in their native, the local language, they also offer it in English. And I think that's a reasonable thing because of the most widely spoken languages in the world, English is going to be the easiest to translate, and the most people are going to be able to read it. And even if somebody isn't really fluent in English, but they're a native speaker of French or German, they can fumble their way through the English in a way one of us could fumble through French or German to get to the right place. So that's something really handy. And again, here's the National Archives of France website. It's offering to translate to English, which it did. And again, you're getting things that are embedded in the photo, in the graphic. And now they offer French, English, French, English, and Spanish. Right. Now, what's this? This is not it. I guess that's, so they offer multiple languages. So and when I did this program 3 years ago, a lot of these places didn't have that. This has been a real change in the last 3 to 5 years of going with having the alternate. So question in the chat about using the browser. I think all of the big browsers now do translate. I think Google's is the most integrated to their system. But you can do it in the others as well. And then someone also asked about when we transcribe records into our family trees, do we use native language spelling or the English version? I tend to use the version that's in the record and then do an alternate if it's a name that's significantly different, especially if the first letter is different, like William and Guillaume, where you have William starting with a W in English and the equivalent name in French starting with a G. But if it's something obvious like Anthony and Antonio, I would probably just put it in as how I encountered it in the record. Does that make sense to everybody? How I do it. Now, most of my personal research is in English or the little bits in Latin and in Catholic records. And yet, with the Catholic records, I definitely, with the Latin, I translate it because by the time of the records I'm looking at in the early 19th century, it's a very mangled Latin. You had priests where they knew enough to write the records, excuse me, in Latin and not much more. And so it's not the classical Latin I learned in high school. So, and again, just to show you one more, here is the, this is the portal for Italian records. And again, we can change to English. And I'm showing you this one because you would think it's only got the Italian, but when you have the cursor over it, you get English as an option. Now, here's where you start getting into the registries. Let's see what works here. And you will have the records when we go, oops. Let's do something else. Let's try this. I wonder what we're missing here. Okay, so put this into English. Oh, and that's not helping. Oh, so we probably want let's see if it just takes baptism. Nope. So I'm not sure what I'm doing wrong here. So, oh, these records aren't digitized, I'm guessing. Again, I can't really read this, but I can pick up, non ha produtto risultate. I'm guessing means not produced results. Anyone agree with that? You guys agree with that there? And then here it's non-digitalizzato, and I'm guessing means they haven't been digitized yet. So that's what's happening there. Even university libraries, this is how it came up for me for the Stockholm University Library. But you'll notice, like down here in the bottom, and again, I don't read Swedish, but I know enough that I'm pretty sure that this says chat with us. Knowing that mit is with in German, so chatte med oss, and I've probably completely massacred the spelling of that. And if you go here, again, it's not doing under the menu, but it's got the rest of the front page. So let's put in we'll see if anything comes up with this. Okay. And as you can see, this is an interesting result. It's only using half the page, but it gives you enough that you can kind of figure out what's there. And as you can see, a lot of it's in English, but not all of it. But it would be enough that you could, sort of work your way through. So let's go to Scotland's people. And I'll log in. And we're going to go into my saved images. So I can show you. So if we go down here, you'll notice here are some Catholic records that were written in Latin. And I'm not seeing the one I want, so we'll go with one of the other ones. So here we have a John McMahon marrying a Margaret McGee. And in this case, we'll take a look. And as you can see, these are written in Latin. And don't panic if this happens, because what you're going to find is that a whole lot of this is boilerplate. Now, in this case, they very nicely put the English name before the entry, so you don't have to look too hard. But what you'll see is they all start out Anno Domini, and they go through, and you have in Civitate Edinburgh, Andrian Collins at Sarum McCabe in Ecclesia Sancta Maria, Interroganei something or other. And a lot of this, you'll be able to figure out what it means. Even though you may not get the real detailed stuff, but look here at the end. So you have ex ritu sanctum matris ecclesia. So I'm guessing this is something about the ritual of the Holy Mother Church. And how about presentibus testibus? I'm guessing that says something along the lines of present and testifying to this marriage happening. In other words, the two witnesses were John Finnegan and Maria Finnegan. And so even though I haven't used Latin since I graduated from high school 4 decades ago, I can read this enough to be able to figure out whether it's a record I want or not. Does that make sense to everybody? How the Latin you can read through and, fortunately, they've got the names capitalized. You can recognize that this is Edinburgh, even though it's in Latin. And what's interesting here is you have church, St. Mary's Church here, and here you have Holy Mother Church. So they're not quite the same, but this is, again, a phrasing that you see in English records for Catholic churches as well. So, and, I would have known from here, the St. Mary's Cathedral is where this happened. So I've got a leg up on figuring out what Ecclesia Sancta Maria means. Is this clear to everyone? What's happening? Okay. So next thing I'm going to show you is we're going to go to the Research Wiki at Family Search. And I'm presuming all of you who've been here for more than about 37 seconds over the last 3 years realize that this is one of my absolute favorite genealogy websites. So what we're going to do is we're going to go down and click on Europe. And we're going to click on, let's go down to Latvia, where I was actually doing some research for somebody recently. I don't speak a word of Latvian. I don't speak a word of any language close to Latvian. So what I ended up doing, if we look here, first of all, this is going to tell me that I'm going to run into a bunch of languages, that and the history of bordered by Russia and Belarus, and it's near, I know it's near Poland and Germany. I'm going to already be thinking, not only are these records not going to be in English, most of them are you're going to have different records in different languages, possibly from the same time and place. And so there are a couple things here that are really helpful. One is the personal names entry, and they will tell you about the names. So for example, it's the given name followed by the family name. They'll tell you that there are male and female endings for names. And that married women take their husband's name with the feminine ending. Looks like surnames are relatively recent for Latvia. They may talk about how the names changed when they came to the US and Canada. And so that's really helpful to know that you've got that, and there are more resources there. But the other thing we can look at that's just as helpful is the Latvian word list. And this is one that's not as fancy as some of them, but you'll notice here we have a list of words. So if we see something, let's say we want to see what baptized would look like, Christits. Well, thinking about that, probably related to the English word christen. Here's the words for being engaged or betrothed. Birth, I don't even want to try Zimshana, maybe. So this gives you the indication that if we go somewhere and look at, say, a church register, we can then figure out which one. The marriages are usually easy to figure out because there are two names. But this would let us figure out whether it's births or baptisms that are being recorded. And so you have all sorts of names here, brother, brother-in-law, citizen, burials. And all of these are things where you can pick your way through a record the way I did with that record in Latin. So we can go back here. We have to back up and get to the right. So we can go to a civil registration record. Let's see. And go to a birth record. I have a kitten trying to climb my leg at the moment, so. And so you see here we have, we would have to look through, and I'm guessing these are location name, maybe not. But let's go back here and see what novads means. We'll go back to the word list. Oh, come on, computer, really? There we go. And now, since these are in the order by English, I'm going to do a Control F and do novads and see if it comes up. How about novad? Nope. So that's not going to help us. But I know this is a city name, so I'm guessing that these are by district. This is the city I was helping. But we can go in here and see what we get. Come on, computer. Well, this isn't working the way I wanted it to. So let's go do another one. And we'll go to Europe. Let's go to Hungary and the whole country. And scroll down here to personal names. And you'll notice here the surname is used before the given name. So this is worth knowing. And so that's helpful. You get a bit about surname origins, and then this nice little bit of information. In other words, you will not be looking for women under a married name, unless and sometimes even when they came to the US, they didn't change it. But that's something to be aware of. It's the same thing in Italy and Scotland, and sometimes in places, Spain, you often got women not taking their husband's name, which can have an implication for the records we're looking at. So let's back up here and let me show you the other way they do this. Here under here they have it under the research tools rather than under background. It's here as well. But you have the word list. And it's the same thing. Now, this one, you can download a PDF. They didn't have that for Latvian. But here we can click on this. And let's say you're going to you're sitting there researching, you may find it easier to use this word list than to use the website. But you'll see they used to print these and sell them. So it looks like they've just digitized and it's not very, I hope this, oh yeah, it's just taking a long time. But this would be nice because you could go through and I would probably, if I were working on this print this off and highlight the ones I think I'm going to use in, and this also has the advantage, you'll notice that it's in alphabetical order by the Hungarian, not the English, which is going to be much easier for finding things if I'm working with this. So that's a big thing there. Everyone with me on this? And how you do have these nice, and you can find these by Googling as well. But the advantage to these word lists is that they were done in a genealogical context, so that you're getting the words you're interested in. And if there are older meanings that aren't in use anymore, or if meanings have shifted, you're getting the older meaning, which is what you're going to be more interested in, for records from 100 and 200 years ago. So that's, and you aren't going to be able to see, you read Hungarian with just reading this page, but it'll give you an idea of how much the words change grammatically. So and it gives you a few ideas about endings that you'll see that you can mostly ignore in your first pass through. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing the screen for a minute till I get to something I want to show you. Let's go to Facebook, and I'll get to where I want to, and then I'll. Okay, so let me get to where I want to be. So what if you need a translation? Well, there are some absolutely wonderful people in the world. And one of the things you can do is, if you're on Facebook, this is the Big Jewish Genealogy group. And a huge chunk of this is people posting this. This is from what's called a Yizkor book, which is a memorial book. And so they're looking for what applies to these people. And so somebody has gone and found those names in here and translated it. You get Hebrew gravestones translated. Here's an announcement of newly organized or newly digitized materials. Okay. And again, here's a tombstone. The other thing that will happen is that you will get people, this is some kind of card that is written in probably Yiddish. And you can see over here, somebody very nicely translated it for them. And there are numerous of these groups on Facebook. It's a very helpful way to do things. Obviously you aren't going to ask for a 7-page letter, but if you have a postcard, it's fine to ask in one of these groups. There's also another one. It's called something like Genealogy. Oops. Genealogy translations. And again, oh, they shut, there's still one going. This says shut down, but there's another one that's still going. It's not this one, evidently. So that's one way to get things translated. The other thing I've sometimes done, if it's the language where I'm not quite sure what's going on, one reason I pulled up the earlier, I pulled up the University of Stockholm. Is that we found a patron I was working with, and I found something in Swedish, and we were getting a lot of it, but it was older. And so we went and found, we went into here and the contact, and found that's the user support. We found one, an email, and emailed it to the person saying, this is, we think this is, this is a Swedish letter from 200 years ago. This is how much we've been able to translate. Is there somebody, it was about a page and a half of a letter. Is there somebody there who can confirm this for us? And a very nice professor of Swedish literature actually wrote back to me and with it. So that's one advantage of trying, not only figuring out that it's your family, but having an idea with that. If it looks like you've tried, you're often able to get the help for the little bit that you can't get. My basic premise on this is don't panic. There are ways to get around almost everything. As I said, you're going to, the place it's going to be hardest is if it's in a non-English alphabet, if it's in Cyrillic or the Hebrew alphabet or Greek. Those are going to be hard to find people, or hard to just sort of plow your way through the way you could through an Italian or a French document with a word list. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. Any questions at this point? Okay, so this is a short one tonight because I think I've pretty much covered it. Look for the website having its own translation of the page if you're looking at modern web pages. If not, Google Translate or the built-in browser is fine. They're not perfect, especially when you get to older records. And if you can't plow your way through something, there are an awful lot of kind people out there who are willing to show off their skills. If you're here in Maine and you're stuck, come into the library or email me if you're not here in Maine, and I can see if I know somebody to pass the request on to. Because I do know several people who are native speakers of Greek or Spanish or whatever that will be glad to help within reason. So that's my blurb. But I wanted to do this before we started in on looking at records from around Europe, so that when I show you things in German and in Italian and such, that you don't panic. Diane, did you have a question?
I do. I have a follow-up to my question about transcribing records in the native language or English.
Yeah.
And I have Slovakian, and they end the female name with ova. They use the married name and then ova. What will elicit, and with place names too, what will elicit the most hints and clarity in my records? Like, in my Ancestry family tree and Family Tree Maker software, what would be the sort of the rules of how to put those names in?
My feeling on those, when you've got things like that are grammatically changing, I would probably put the feminine name in, the feminine ending on a last name, because that's how you're going to see it in the records,
Okay.
at least in Europe. Here in the US, you won't as much. I know a couple weeks ago when when I've showed people, I have one about, it's a Polish family in the US, and some of the names are still gendered and some aren't. In things like new obituaries. But I would say that I'd put the form that you're likely to find the most records in. And then once they come to the US, if the kids settle into one form that's a little different, I'd put their name in that one. A lot of it is, what's going to help you get further back on the family tree. And for the most part, websites like Ancestry do build in the Kaminska versus Kaminsky as a last name from Poland. They will treat those similarly in the search engine. But in terms of knowing what you're looking for, I think that putting it in the way they would have seen it as normal.
And so within Ancestry, if the family changed their name when they came here for the English version to sound more like their native language, which I have Euros, Jurus or OS, and they changed that to a YORROSH. Does Ancestry, do you put one in parentheses and then will it pick up both spellings?
I'm not quite, it lets you do an alternate and it will work on both of them. But
Okay.
I would also separately search records under both.
With both names.
Just because the machine searches are amazing these days. I mean, I think how search engines work at places like Ancestry are just, compared to what we would have been happy with 15 years ago, they're amazing, but they're not perfect. And so you'll want to look, like that family that had the Krajewska and Krajewski and Kaminsky and Kaminska. I would still take the time to do both just to be certain that I'm getting everything. Just as I said, it's just to be on the safe side, because you don't want something where for some reason the search function doesn't pick up that particular variation for some reason. Yeah, so we get a comment here about often their national genealogical groups online. Yeah, their local genealogists who are members and willing to help with translation problems. That's another good point. So you get here in Maine, there are multiple Franco-American genealogical societies here, and in New Hampshire. I know there's a huge German genealogical society in Pittsburgh. Most major cities have a Jewish genealogical society, where you're probably going to be able to get Hungarian and Ukrainian and Yiddish translated. There are several big Yiddish organizations. There's the YIVO, the Yiddish Institute of something in New York City, and the Yiddish Book Center in Massachusetts. By the way, the Yiddish Book Center in Massachusetts, the man who founded it wrote a book called Outwitting History. If you want a fairly lightweight, fun read about saving Yiddish literature, and preserving the books. It's quite an interesting read by Aaron Lansky. And looks at some of the behind the scenes of just how much work it takes to build and maintain even a fairly narrow collection like that. He tells the wonderful story that they got to the point when they were collecting books, they realized they had to take 3 people on every trip to collect books, because they're doing this in New York City. And so there's one to drive the car around and deal, when they can't park, one to move the books, and one to sit with the little old lady and eat the cookies she'd made. And so, even though it's little old Jewish ladies, I could just see, if somebody was collecting Italian or German books, you'd be hitting cannoli and strudel at the same time. Because, that, I think that's one of those universals that you wouldn't just have to be a little old Jewish lady. You could be Italian or whatever. When I was growing up, our neighbors on one side were Italian, and she was actually born in Italy and came to the US as a baby, but had learned to bake from her mother, and she made the most amazing Italian style little cookies. And so I always looked forward to the Christmas because she'd send us this big, huge package of them. So anyway, that was a diversion you didn't need to know. Okay. So on the browser translation, if it's not in English, at least with Google, it will automatically offer. Let me pull up Edge and see what happens. And I will let you know. I think it's built into them now. So let's do a okay, let me share my screen again. So here we get the cookies. And I don't know if you saw it, but it was there. And here you'll see there's this thing. It says show translate options. And hit translate. So there may be a similar thing, but I don't know why it's saying it couldn't be translated. Let's try another one. And you'll see here, there isn't a translate option here, but once the language changes, I'm going to put it into French, it pops up. And hit translate. I don't know why it's not doing these. This is Edge. It comes up automatically in Chrome. There is an Irish American Heritage Center with some genealogical support down in Portland for whoever asked that question in the chat. But yet, finding that your records go back to a language that you don't speak is not sort of the end of your ability to do anything genealogical. So, okay, let me stop the recording.